Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Phil Behenna, and I'm going to be presenting today on the container house that my wife and I are building in the United States. I do want to take a moment to say thank you to Patrick Hicks and the CTIA for allowing me to present. I apologize that I can't be there in person, but as some of you may have followed, we are experiencing a very intense fire season in the western United States at the moment, and I'm needed fairly close to home. You will be able to see from the following slides that we live in a remote location where wildfire is an ever-present threat. I've divided this presentation up into a series of chapters to describe where we are and why we chose to build with containers before getting off into the nitty-gritty of what we've actually done. But I'd like to start by explaining where it is that we live. We live on a remote parcel of land in the northeastern corner of Nevada. For a lot of people, Nevada is certainly Las Vegas and perhaps Reno, and they're not familiar with perhaps very much other than that. Nevada is a very big state with not very many people in it, and the area that we live in is one of the least densely populated, probably anywhere in the United States. We are approximately 400 miles north of Las Vegas, about the same distance, about 400 miles east of Reno and Lake Tahoe, and we are about 200 miles west of Salt Lake City. The land round here is big and empty and covered with a mixture of vegetation. The area is known as the Great Basin, and it has a lot of pinyon, pine trees, a lot of juniper, and an awful lot of sagebrush. We've been living here for about a year, and we are building our container house. Our property is, as I say, remote. It's based on about 800 acres, and it is surrounded by more than 1,000 square miles of wilderness. We are about 35 to 40 miles from the nearest town, although that town is in itself very small with only about 1,000 people. The climate that we have to deal with at the site is quite extreme. Vegas, everybody knows, gets hot in the summer. It doesn't get terribly cold in the winter. We get extremes of both. In the summer, we can get very hot. Not as hot as Vegas, but certainly close on 100 Fahrenheit, close, so that's about 40 centigrade. In the winter, we go well below freezing. It's quite possible for us to go 25 centigrade below, and occasionally, once in a blue moon, we might see temperatures colder than negative 30 centigrade, 35. So the range of temperatures that we're dealing with at the site is extreme. We're dealing with a range of perhaps 65 to 70 centigrade shift between winter and summer. So that gives you a sense of where we're building and the sort of location that we're living in. So with that being the case, you could ask a very valid question: why would you build with metal boxes if you're having to deal with such temperature swings? Metal being such a great conductor, aren't you just causing problems for yourself by being too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter? Well, I don't know that there is any building material that is perfect. Most houses around here are built with wood, same as they are in California. We don't have any nearby quarries, and there really isn't anybody with the skills to build in brick or in stone. But we do have to contend with two significant risks in this area. The first one is wildfire. as I said, we are experiencing a very intense wildfire season this year. And just in the year and a half that we've been living here, we've had fires within half a mile. We had a fire earlier this season within 3 miles. Last year, one within 4 miles. And burning perhaps 20 or 30 miles away, we've had a fire that was 100 square miles. When wildfire catches here, it burns quickly and intensely. And the fact that we are so far from town, and that even there is only a volunteer fire department, means that wildfire is something we have to consider very carefully. If we had a wooden house, there is a very strong likelihood that it would burn down. So that's the first consideration. The second consideration is earthquake. We, by no means do we live in the most seismically active part of the United States. But there are faults, and in 2008, I believe it was, our nearest town got hit with a 6 to 6.5 earthquake. And as you can see from some of the pictures, it was pretty destructive, and it caused a lot of damage both to the few brick buildings and the wooden buildings in town, and they collapsed, and they're still down to this day. So it was a significant earthquake. So those are the two big things that we have to live with, and the decision to build with containers was definitely impacted by those considerations. If we build with metal, then we will be far more resistant against wildfire. And by building with containers, we create a sandwich-like structure that is very protective of the inhabitants inside. If you can visualize it, we will have a foundation on which the containers are sitting and to which they are welded, and then a roof structure that sits over the top of the intact container roofs themselves. What that means is we have a living space that is protected from above, from falling debris by the container roofs, and which is then welded to a very strong concrete foundation. I don't think you can build an earthquake-proof structure, but ours should resist damage for a lot longer than brick or wooden buildings. So we have made the decision to build with containers, at least in part, because it affords us some protection against the two big risks, earthquake and wildfire, and then we have to live with the inconveniences of being too hot or being too cold, and insulate the containers to help mitigate that issue. So, having covered our location, hopefully now you understand at least one or two of the reasons why we had decided to build with containers. I'm now going to go on to what it is that we are building. The house, in its final status, will consist of 11 40-foot high cubes. We've built the house in 2 phases. A first phase, which is really a so-called tiny house, consists of just 2 40-foot high cubes, and they are shown at the top of the schematic of the architectural plan, and they are the 2 containers that are greyed out. Underneath them and immediately touching them and abutting to them is the main house, and that consists of 9 40-foot high cubes laid out in the structure shown. What we have is then 2 containers lying across the top, 4 laid at 90 degrees to them, comprising a central corridor and our guest rooms and the office. 3 containers laid out in the same direction as the top two, and they comprise the living room, kitchen and dining room, and then 2 containers exactly at the bottom, mirroring the first 2, and those make up our master bedroom. The first 2 containers give us about 640 square feet of living space. The other 9 give us about 2,900, and the whole structure gives us about 3,500 square feet. So that's about 340 square meters of living space. It's open plan, and it is all on one layer. We have not decided to build up, partly at least to keep the house structure low to prevent lightning strike, and also so that we can blend in a little bit more in the landscape. We made the decision to use new containers. We built them with the help of one of my company's Container Interchange's customers. They helped build them for us. They built them to our spec, and then Container Interchange one-wayed those boxes from Shanghai into Long Beach, and the initial modifications to the containers were made by a subsidiary of Con Global in Long Beach. Once that modification had been done in Long Beach, we then had to truck the boxes the close on 700 miles from Long Beach up to our site, and we did this again in 2 waves. We brought the first 2 containers in April of 2017. We moved into those first 2 containers in July of 2017, and then we brought the remaining 9 containers in November of last year. In each case, the boxes had to be loaded onto specialist trucks. We didn't encounter any issues during the transportation, but we did take some steps to secure and strengthen the containers during transit. One of the issues that you have is that when you modify a container, you compromise its strength. And for the vast majority of the journey, that wasn't a problem because the highways were good. But the last 7 or 8 miles of the journey to our house is over roughish dirt road, and the containers experienced some twisting and some up and down movement. And so we put in strengthening bars to support them during that phase. Once at our site, we hired a local crane company to move the boxes over the top of the foundations. I touched briefly on the sandwich-like construction that we have gone for. The containers sit on supporting walls. Underneath the first 2 containers is a rectangular supporting concrete wall that carries the 2 containers, and then inside the void underneath the containers there are supporting pillars to take the edges of the boxes. As the boxes were craned in, they were then welded down both onto the foundations and to each other. As we built the concrete supporting wall, we embedded metal weld plates so that the containers could be welded not just to each other, but to the foundation itself. The foundation wall underneath the first 2 boxes is 7 feet deep, so essentially 2 meters deep. That is actually deeper than is required by our county code, but it is a deep basement so that we can store our solar batteries and try to maintain a more consistent temperature year-round. Underneath the other 9 containers, we have a similar supporting wall and pillar type construction, but it is marginally shallower, somewhere between 4 and 5 feet, about a meter 50 centimeters deep. Some of that is dictated by the county code and the need for us to protect ourselves from winter frost and freezing. So underneath the containers you have the concrete supporting walls, then you have the living space, the actual containers, and then on top of that you have a roof structure to support a metal roof. And the roof trusses are fastened to the containers at the top, and then the metal roof and the fascia and the soffit go onto that. Now, I explained that the initial modification of the boxes was done in Long Beach by ConGlobal. What they did was to cut the boxes according to our architectural plans and to install doors and windows, or at least apertures for doors and windows, prior to the boxes being moved. Once the boxes have got here, we then have worked with a local general contractor and his subcontractors, electricians and plumbers, etc., to complete all of the rest of the work. And I'm going to take a moment to talk a little bit about permitting and general contractors. So our county, Elko County, had never seen a container house before. Certainly nothing official. And it was important to us that this was official, that we were not just chunking down some boxes on our land, but that this was a proper house, permitted, etc. They'd never done it before. They had no real concept of how containers are constructed, where their strength lies. And so this has been a learning exercise for them, working with us and with the structural engineering team to make sure that we get everything right. The county have been very supportive. They made things clear at the start and essentially said, it doesn't matter. Yes, it's fine to work with containers. You will need to meet county code requirements in all respects, but we don't have a specific problem with you using containers. The general contractor, we are fortunate. We have one who is reasonably local, about 40 miles away, and he has been able to access electricians and plumbers and people to do the insulation. Again, reasonably close. But again, that general contractor had no experience whatsoever of working with containers before, and it has been a learning curve for him, and at times even an eye-opening experience, I think, for all of us. To give you just some examples of things that we have encountered, we've discovered that even though our containers were built new and were built from the same batch and have sequential numbers, they are not identical in all respects. There are some marginal differences in measurements. It's fractions of an inch. But of course, when you're building with the containers as opposed to moving cargo with them, you spot the tiny differences in measurements. So some of the containers are slightly higher than the others. Not much, but you notice it. Some of them are slightly longer than the others. And in one case, on our corridor box, we've encountered a situation where the steel in the roof feels noticeably different underfoot at one end of the box versus the other. The way the general contractor has described it is that the boxes are, that particular area feels spongy underfoot, whereas, as he describes it, walking over the top of our master bedroom, it feels rigid and strong. And so one of the learning exercises in all of this is that you think containers are going to be this absolutely homogeneous, identical instrument, and that isn't the case. We've also discovered it with drilling and with welding. Drilling, sometimes one area will break a drill bit and another area the drill will go through very quickly. And welding, we've seen situations where sometimes the metal melts at a very consistent pace, and at other times it sort of undergoes a sort of partial collapse where a larger area will suddenly melt much faster under the welding torch, and that makes this sort of thing, working with the material, a little bit more challenging. But generally, we have been lucky. We found contractors and we found county inspectors and permitters who have helped work with us. The design that we chose for the containers was our own. We didn't employ an architectural firm. My wife and I designed the house as functionally as we felt was necessary, and so it's our design. We had a few guiding principles as we designed, and I'll explain what those were. The first one related to the internal roof, the ceiling of the containers. And as you can see from some of the pictures, it is raw metal. We have not installed additional floating ceilings or false ceilings fastened to the inside of the containers. When you look up inside the house, what you see is the corrugation of the containers. And the only thing up on the ceiling will be light installations and the penetrations for roofs, for chimneys, for heaters and fireplaces. And one of the reasons that we have kept it so simple is just for simplicity's sake, and partly, again, it's to protect us in the case of an earthquake, because the less that we have up there, the less that can fall on our heads. So the first basic principle was keep the ceiling simple. The second basic guiding principle was we didn't want to disguise the fact that we were living in a container. This is not a space where you enter and you forget that you are living in a container. We have, wherever possible, maintained the aesthetic. And so on internal walls, if they are facing the outside air, then we have no choice. We have to insulate, which means we have to install 2x4 walls and pump the blown foam insulation into those walls and then cap it with drywall, which creates then an internal false wall. And we have to do that on external walls because otherwise we wouldn't be able to keep ourselves warm. But where we have containers touching each other, or where we have internal walls that are not required to be insulated, we have made a decision to just leave those bare and to have them as the original container walls. For a start, what we've discovered is they are very magnetic, and it makes hanging things, whether that's kitchen utensils, knives, saucepans, etc., or pictures, it makes things so easy because you can just put a magnet up and hang something without any difficulty whatsoever. So it's partly aesthetic and it's partly functional. Those were really the guiding principles. We did consider to leave the floor as the bamboo floor which we ordered. There is in fact a slight marketing design inlaid into the floor, and we have made a decision that we're actually laying tile across that, and I can show you pictures of that later. But if you wanted to find a guiding principle, it would be keep it as simple as you can. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the decision that we made to put a pitched, sloping roof on top of the intact containers. I've seen a lot of pictures of container houses around the world, some of them in more temperate, even tropical climates than ours, and there is no pitched roof on top of the containers. A lot of those are one-box installations, perhaps two. For us, we've got 11 containers abutting up next to each other. And we have made a decision to install a pitched roof over the top of the containers for a number of reasons. The first one is that space in between the container roof and the pitched roof gives us somewhere to put our insulation. And we need a lot of insulation. The county requires that we have R20 in the walls and R40 in the ceiling. R30 in the ceiling, I apologise. What we've actually done is to go for R40 in the walls and R60 in the ceilings. So basically we're doubling the county code requirement. And that's a conscious decision because we do not have air conditioning or centralised heating, and we've made a decision that to be energy efficient, we will insulate the house well and then use stoves to heat us in the winter, and simply natural through draft to keep us cool in the summer. So at least part of the reason to have a pitched roof is to give us somewhere to put all of that insulation. And that insulation in the roof, for instance, will consist of R40 made up of blown foam and then additional insulating material laid on top of that with an R rating of about 20 to give us a combined total of about 60. But by putting it into that invisible space above our heads, we get the benefit of it without being able to see it. So that's the first reason. It helps to create an insulating space. The second reasons to have a pitched roof over the top of us is because of precipitation. This is a big roof, approximately 3,000 square feet over the phase 2 section, the 9 boxes. Well, you can do the math. If you have an overhang and you allow for a slightly larger for the actual roof coverage, if you have an inch of rain that drops on that roof, it will create about 3,000 gallons of water. Well, that needs to go somewhere. And if you have 9 containers welded to each other and nowhere for that rain to go, it will find a way in. Containers are naturally crowned and they will shed the water, but if you weld them together, the water just gravitates towards the seam. And making a perfect waterproof seam by welding, particularly given the inconsistencies in the metal that I described earlier, across multiple 40-foot lengths, that's pretty difficult. And all it takes is one pinhole, and you will have a leak, and all of that water on the roof will just naturally find its way to that pinhole and into your house. So at least part of another reason to have the pitched roof is for us to be able to shed rainfall. And then thirdly, snow. We get probably coming on for a metre of snow over the winter. Not all of that will fall at once, but you don't need much snow lying on top of containers to deform the roof. If you've ever walked around on top of a 40-foot container, you'll note that it's not as rigid as you think it's going to be. It flexes and bends under your body weight. And if you have a heavy amount of spring wet snow sitting on the roof for any period of time, it could deform it, and it'll certainly then melt, and again it'll find that pinhole. And so combination of needing somewhere to put the insulation and wanting to shed precipitation made us decide that we were going to have a pitched roof. What we'll do is cover the wooden trusses of the roof with metal so that at the end of the day, as you can see from the pictures of finished phase 1, what you have is metal containers sitting on a concrete base and then with metal fascia and aluminium roofing on the top of the wooden structure. And that again gives us much more protection in the case of a wildfire, because the embers travelling around in the wildfire have much less chance to ignite anything. So in this last chapter, I want to talk a little bit about what the experience of living in a container house is like. Is it a good idea, and what does it feel like? On the whole, I think it's worked. I mean, I don't think that a container house is a suitable or a viable idea everywhere. But as I explained at the beginning, we had a couple of very good reasons for wanting to have a metal house, and containers is a suitable way to go. We've been lucky with the permitting, we've been lucky with the contractors. That's not to say that it's all plain sailing. The fact that the county are unfamiliar with it creates at least time delays. The general contractor can make mistakes. Working with a metal structure it's interesting. The expansion and contraction noises, for instance, that we hear, you get used to them, but sometimes it's a bit like being on a ship. There are metal noises. It is not a silent space. I think we've all got used to it, but you hear these bangs and clanks occasionally as the building heats up and cools down. One of the things that we could have anticipated could have caused us some problems but actually hasn't is the satellite and Wi-Fi technology. Because we're in such a remote location, we need satellite internet. We have a Wi-Fi router in our basement, and then that propagates a Wi-Fi network throughout the building. There was at least some concern that the sheer volume of metal would cause an issue with that signal, but it really hasn't. It's worked just fine. And by and large, issues of condensation, etc., have not at this point been an issue, and we have now been here for more than a year. So on the whole, not bad. I think we will have a lot more experience over the coming years, and as you can see, we have still some way to go before we finish the house. But we have now lived in it for a year, more than in phase 1, and we are obviously moving on to finish phase 2. So it's workable. We're living in it. In terms of cost, I think, in theory, building with containers should be marginally cheaper than building with traditional materials. And certainly you can build a big space quickly, although you have to remember that having built that big space, you've then got to finish it out using traditional materials. So there will be a cost attached to simply going big. I suspect that our finish cost won't be much different from the cost had we chosen to build in a traditional way, but I do believe at the end of the day that we will have a house that is more resistant to wildfire, stronger in the case of an earthquake, and sufficiently insulated and strong to withstand pretty much everything that this area can throw at it. With that said, I'm going to draw this to a close. I'm very happy to take questions. Obviously, I'm not here in person, so please feel free to relay those to Patrick Hicks or to me directly. Patrick can give you my email address. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon. Goodbye.